So we actually did read 17 last week. We're starting in 18, but we're going to read 17 because verse 18 begins with for Christ. So that tells us that he's connecting to the previous idea. So we're going to start with 17. So here's what it says. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting way for him to start this idea, right? So verse 17 suggests that if we use our own smarts, we can actually mess up what the cross has done. If we start trying to use your brain, not that you shouldn't use your brain, but if you start like overly thinking and coming up with your own ideas and inserting your own ideas, you can actually mess up what the cross is doing. A lot of people struggle to find good theology because their brains are in the way. It's kind of this idea of I can't get past myself, so I can't accept the truth. It's like I won't accept what the word says until I can wrap myself around it. But that doesn't change whether or not what the word says is true. It just changes our ability to accept what's true. And there are some things, I'll admit, that, about the cross that are hard to reconcile, right? For example, the cross unites people and it divides people. It does both, right? We're made sinless, but we also wrestle with our flesh in this life. God is just, but he's also full of grace and mercy, right? We have the problem of evil, which is a whole other debate that, you would get into in apologetics with an atheist. And so often the things that prevent us from actually knowing God is just our own personal thoughts, opinions, and hang-ups, right? And so this is why baptism and the whole I am ofing, I am of Paul, I am of Peter, were causing problems because they were inserting their own thoughts into the equation and not just paying attention to what God had done. And then so Paul quotes something here. He's actually quoting Isaiah 29:14, but it's not a direct quote. He says, Therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden. Okay? We think we're so smart. And the funny thing is, there are some smart people out there. Some of the smartest people in the world don't believe in God. When you think of guys like Richard Dawkins, Ernest Hemingway, Christopher Hitchens, very intelligent people that didn't believe in God. So we assume, right, surely smart people must have it figured out because they're smart. But the problem is that smart people have a huge problem, and that's that they're humans and they learn like the rest of us, right? They still have to learn through experience and memorization, logical connection, right? And smart people happen to be better at doing those things than most people are. But you know what happens when you live your whole life being good at learning things that people tell you? You get used to being right. And you forget how to deal with being wrong. The hardest people to convince they are wrong are the people that only know how to be right, aka smart people, right? Smart people have that problem where it's like they have elevated their own knowledge to the point where they can't accept that they might actually not have something right. And even if they're confronted and they see it, a lot of times they can argue their way into sounding right because they're so smart, and that actually works to their detriment. So how hard is it to admit that you might be wrong about it if you are an expert in the wisdom of the world? It would probably be very difficult. There's a story I read about Albert Einstein. Anybody ever heard of Albert Einstein before? Okay. So he said that there was a student in one of his classes that decided there was no God. He said, I've decided there's no God. And Einstein said, how much knowledge do you think we collectively have in this class? So what percentage do you think they came up with? Class of smart college kids. What percentage of worldly knowledge do you think they said all of them together collectively had?
It was large.
What do you think?
10%.
10? What? 0.5?
I mean, that they claimed?
That they claimed they had together as a class. 70, 80?
These are college kids?
Yeah.
100%?
Yeah. Sure.
I'm thinking this.
Well, not high school kids, but Well, here's what they actually said. They said 5%. They said 5%. And Einstein said, that's probably pretty generous. But then Einstein asked the question, he said, do you think it's possible that God exists in the 95% we don't know? It's a good question, right? So how can we be so confident in our 5% or less of knowledge and still, like, how can we be so confident in that? 5% or less and not think that there might be something in the 95 that we don't understand, right? There's a great old black and white movie called Harvey. Anybody ever seen Harvey before? Okay, I love the movie Harvey. I've only seen it twice, and I think it's just the greatest movie ever, right? If you haven't seen it, it's Jimmy Stewart is in the movie. He has an invisible rabbit following him around, and everybody thinks he's crazy. And the whole movie, you're kind of thinking, is he crazy? Is he not crazy? And then like footprints start to appear, and you realize, oh, there really is an invisible rabbit. But anyway, there's a quote from that movie that when I saw, I was like, I need to remember this quote. And so I think of this quote all the time because I think it's great advice for life. All right. And here's what he said. Jimmy Stewart said, years ago, my mother used to say to me, she'd say, in this world, Elwood, you must be, she always called me Elwood. In this world, Elwood, you must be oh so smart or oh so pleasant. Well, for years I was smart. I recommend pleasant. You may quote me. So I just quoted him. You know, there is so much more to life than just learning facts and data, right? And really, how many facts and how much data have we come up with as human beings that is that impressive, right? Man's wisdom nowadays says things like, you do you, you can be whatever you want to be, you can manifest things by your will, we don't need God anymore. Are those things true just because we think we've come so far that we figured it out? We think we're so smart. But God destroys all of those things with no effort by him. If you want to learn something that's actually valuable and indestructible, we have to look at the Word of God. Yeah, and I think it's important that we realize that artists and philosophers are both intelligent people with great talents that, yeah, with value. And I think that's part of the point that I'm trying to make is that man's pursuit of secular humanist knowledge has its limitations, right? And a person, and I'll get into this further as we go, but if a person simply tries to use their own humanist views to figure out whether or not there's a God, they'll never get there. Because, you know, God's wisdom isn't just man's wisdom times 10. God's wisdom is actually completely opposite to man's wisdom frequently, right? It's a completely different thing altogether. And man's wisdom can't compete with that. I mean, there are people that look at the Bible and they laugh, right? You know, oh, you think that there's this, what do they call him, the magical fairy god or the sky fairy or whatever they call him, that just created everything? Like, you're ridiculous. That's just stupid, right? And so even just the very concept of God is contrary to humanism. I mean, we just, you know, that's just what we do. You believe that God would come and die for the sins of the world? That's preposterous, right?
Yeah, who would do a thing like that?
Right, who would do a thing like that, right? We think that what God does, because it's counterintuitive to the things that we hold as value because we're human, that we think it doesn't make sense, right? Like, you know, we think that God must get tired like we do. We think God must be selfish like we are. We think God must, you know, that if he's not pursuing the things that we would naturally pursue, you know, it's like we know atheists that can't even imagine not pursuing money. Like the concept of not going after money is just so foreign to them, right? And for now, you know, we all, at some point, we're all going to have to stand before God, and there's just no way around that, right? And so we have a choice. We can either keep trying to figure out the universe on our own, or we can look to the one who made it and see what he has to say. So Paul is actually going to go a little bit deeper into this, and he's going to give us an example of he's going to take what I just said, or what he just said, and then give us an example. But before we get there, do we have any questions on any of that stuff? Okay, let's get into this next section. I think this next section will be a little bit helpful. So 1 Corinthians 1:22. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So, from the beginning of Israel as a nation, right, they were always looking for the Messiah, right? So our current series over in the sanctuary on Sunday mornings, we started with Moses, and then Moses said that there would someday come another prophet like him, right? And of course we know that that's Jesus. But they were always looking for this next prophet to come, right? And throughout the Old Testament, there were lots of things that Jews were supposed to be looking for, right? They knew that there would be a star over his birthplace. They knew that he would be pierced and hanged on a tree. They knew he'd be born in Bethlehem. They knew that he would enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They knew he'd be born of a virgin. They knew he would be a descendant of David. They knew that he would be betrayed. So they knew that all these signs were going to be fulfilled by the Messiah. And so Jews became obsessed with these signs. And then Jesus came, sorry, go ahead.
Didn't they also have the misconception that he was coming as a conquering?
Right, and that's actually something I'm going to bring up a little later, so sneak preview with that. There is not a single Jewish writer before Christ that ever realized that the Messiah would be a suffering servant, that wrote about it. There's zero examples from antiquity that we have. They just didn't, they assumed, right, and even when they read like the passages, well, right, yeah. So even in the passages in Isaiah that we've gone through, that we went through this last week, where it's like the suffering servant that being pierced for our transgressions, and they'd pull out his beard and all that kind of stuff, they were like, oh, that must be a different guy. They couldn't even fathom that the Messiah would be the one to do that. And so anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. But they were so hyper fixated on signs that when the signs were actually fulfilled, they missed it. And when you think about what the Pharisees were doing when Jesus came, what did they do? It's like Jesus is here and he's doing miracles and stuff, performing the signs, and what do? Give us more signs, right? That's not enough. Give us more. And then every time he fulfills a sign, they're like, that didn't count. Oh, the demons helped you do it. Or oh, you can't do miracles on the Sabbath. That's not right, right? So they're sitting there and Jesus is giving them these very clear signs that this is the Messiah here to change the world, and all they can do is confirm what they already believe, trying to find something to confirm what they already think. They wanted signs, but no sign was ever enough. Now the Greeks, however, completely different system. They were more like we are today, and all they wanted was reason and logic and arguments. That's how they wanted to find truth. And logic and reason are good things, right? And that's what you were saying, right? Is that we don't throw away our intelligence to blindly follow something, right? It's important to know apologetics because the world has questions and we need to have a defense for our faith.
And God made and created our brains, so
Yeah.
it's important to use them.
But just like, he also, he created our sexual organs as well, right? And we should use them in an appropriate way. Our brains work the same way, right? He created them, but we also have to use them appropriately because we can definitely use our brains for not good, right? So, some of the wartime atrocities that we've seen in history were all came up with the human brain, right? So we can abuse that too. So logic and reason are good things, but they're not the only things. And you know what happens when you have a person who's very logical, very reasonable, but they lack everything else? They're called alexithmiacs. Or another word, or more familiar words would be something like a sociopath or a psychopath, right? Somebody who doesn't have like emotional, empathetic type, it's like, oh, everything to me fits in these boxes and I don't have a sense of humor and I don't care about people and I don't have emotional, EQ. And it's like, so when you only work in that realm of logic and reason, you're actually limited because just like the artists, right? There's value in doing something that doesn't just fit in these rigid boxes. So God is a holistic being and logic and reason can help us find him. But what's interesting is we can also find God with emotion and wisdom and experience, right? We have to understand that the miraculous, by definition, goes outside of rational and logical conclusions, right? So if Jesus came back today and did a miracle, most people would come up with a logical explanation for why it wasn't actually a miracle, right? Ward, you're a magician, right? You make things look good, right? And they would assume that that's what Jesus was doing, right? We try to come up with rational explanation. Yeah, it's a trick, right? We can't help ourselves. And so instead, God goes against all expectations, and he shows up as a human being. He goes to the cross on our behalf and takes our punishment. That makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense. So the gospel is what it is. It doesn't change. It's always true. And we may want to change it to make it more relevant today. But the truth is, the gospel wasn't relevant to ancient Jews or ancient Greeks either. They would have to twist it. They were trying to twist it into something more comfortable as well. So we have to realize that Christ is true even when we don't understand or agree or like it. Okay, let's go to the next section here. So this is talking about how we display God's wisdom and the world's foolishness at the same time. So 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 31. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. What just happened here? He also chose me to mess this up. Okay, God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. So that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. So, this is a good exercise if you are a saved person. He says, look at yourself. How many Christians lack worldly knowledge and have a history of sin, and yet somehow are deemed worthy by God to be saved? I mean, does that make any sense whatsoever?
Not worldly knowledge?
Yeah, you unintelligent, unsophisticated, uneducated, have a history of sin, and yet God chooses to save them. I mean, shouldn't Jesus come, or shouldn't he not have to come?
Shouldn't we get what we deserve?
Shouldn't we get what we deserve?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what makes sense. To mankind, that concept seems dumb. And there are some questions too. Could Christ save like David Berkowitz and Jeffrey Dahmer? You know, a couple of serial killers. If they were to repent, could Christ save Hitler and Stalin? And then could you take guys like Gandhi and Morgan Freeman, and they could end up in hell because they don't believe in Christ? I mean, does that make any sense?
Morgan Freeman doesn't believe in God? I thought he did.
He's like a universalist. Here's a better question. Could Jesus save you? I mean, we get so hung up thinking about questions like that, right? Like, well, how come serial killers get off the hook, but the nice guys don't? And it's like, if we actually look at ourselves, like, none of us deserve to get off the hook. You know, we don't want, when it comes to issues of our sin, we don't want justice. Because we can't afford it. Our own sin, there's nothing we can do about it. Right, we're completely helpless, and for Christ to choose to save us is an act of mercy that we just can't even fathom, and that's all there is to it. I mean, can I fathom that a good and perfect God would save me? No. To go to a cross and to suffer horribly on my account, to me, that sounds foolish. Why would God ever want to go to a cross for me? That makes no sense. And yet, in God's infinite wisdom, he chose to make that decision, that he would go to the cross for his children. And because of that, in the end, no one gets to boast, right? We're supposed to look at God in that account and boast of him and what he's done rather than our own selves. Even though Bill Gates donates more money than any of us have ever seen, he can't boast in the presence of God for what he's done. And you know, God calls the weak and the ignorant to him. Right? The lowly. And earthly knowledge, even though it's a good thing, there's no amount of earthly knowledge that will ever save you. True wisdom only belongs to those who know Christ. And so as believers, we may not get calculus or quantum physics or music theory, but we know the most important thing, that Christ died for us. And because of that, Christ then becomes our wisdom in the things that actually matter. And see, and that's the distinction, is does the wisdom we are seeking actually matter? So if mankind was able to learn 100% of everything in the physical universe and then we were wiped off the planet, would our knowledge of it actually matter? So Paul gives us three things then after that, three benefits for us. He says righteousness. So we think of righteousness sometimes, I think, a little bit wrong. We think, oh, well, we're legally declared not guilty, so that makes us righteous. No. It's great that we're not guilty. That's a good thing, right? But we actually have positive righteousness. Like we are credited to righteousness because of Christ. So not only do we no longer have any debt, but now we're rich, right? Because of Christ's sacrifice. That's what it means to be righteous for his sake, right? And he says we're sanctified, which means to be holy or to be set apart, which means we are set apart now to be different from the world and to do good works, and that's part of our sanctification process. But also, the ultimate sanctification takes part in the future when we get to spend eternity with God, okay? So our sanctification long-term has a long-term goal, and then but that process starts now on Earth. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we have to find a reason to accept what things say. I mean, how many people are critical of the Bible because they, if the Bible isn't our source of morality, we make up our own morality, right? And so, and then we think that if the Bible differs from what we collectively think, that it must be wrong because we're just used to that democratic version of morality where, well, if we all agree, then that's right, and if God disagrees, then he's wrong. And it's like those type of things where that's where human wisdom starts to fall apart. It's imperfect. Right. And the other thing too is keep in mind we're talking about wisdom here. So I'm jumping ahead in my notes here, but one of the things we have to remember about wisdom is we're not just talking about knowledge. So we're also talking about the application of knowledge, right? Because there are lots of smart people that know, I mean, what's the saying, babe? If I knew everything about, if I put to practice everything I know about health and wealth, we'd all be thin and rich. But we're not, because even though we know better, we don't do better because which is unwise, right? It's unwise if it's like, I know eating less is better for me. I know not, putting more money in the slot machine is whatever, right? But we do it anyway because we don't always make wise decisions.
It's not what you know, it's what you do with what you know.
Right. And if you guys remember back to the wisdom series that we did in, not Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, we talked a lot there about how also skills are a form of wisdom in Scripture as well. So being able to, Pat's woodworking ability is wisdom in the Hebrew sense of the word, that he's able to have knowledge, apply it, and form a skill and ability to do something, right? Same thing with, musical ability, or, I would even say, running like an Apache is a is a form. If you guys don't know this, Candy likes to run through the woods like an Apache warrior. If you didn't know that, those are your words, Candy. I got that from you.
Full dress, run through the woods.
Depends on the day.
So I think it's important that we realize that too. And I realize I probably make it sound like anybody who's smart is dumb. Like, no, I'm saying that if we assume that of our own brains we can come up with all the answers we need, definition of humanism, then we are foolish to think that. Even if you are so smart, right? You can be so smart that you're foolish. And if you don't accept the wisdom of God, that is what's actually foolish, where God flips things on their head. So the last word that he brings up here is redemption, but there's a fourth word, but we'll get there. The word redemption there is actually the same one that they would use in the slave trade. So when somebody was set free as a slave, they would, the same word for redemption is what they would use to describe them. So we're no longer slaves to our sin, we're set free. We're free now to pursue the good things of Christ and free from the punishment of sin. And then finally, Paul he refers to Jeremiah here in Jeremiah 9:23. It says, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth, for in these things I delight, declares the Lord." So you can see there, we're not meant to build ourselves up, right? We can build up our credentials all we want, but our credentials will never be enough to do what Christ did. So instead, the good things about us come from what God's doing. And honestly, even our own intelligence or abilities or whatever, those things also come from the Lord, and they can be taken away just as quickly. So our victories don't actually show, specifically as Christians, our victories don't show how great we are. They show how great God is. Because we know who we are by ourselves, and anything good that we have is because that's how God works. So let's flip over to chapter 2. We could probably at least get this first section started. So my goal of getting through 16 chapters this summer is probably not going to happen. But so chapter 2 is starting with the gospel is simple. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. So and keep in mind here as I start to read this that remember this book is a letter, right? So there were no chapters, there were no verses when this was originally written. This all flowed into one thing. So Paul wasn't sitting there telling Sosthenes to write and said, okay, now we're on chapter 2. This was just a letter that flowed through. So keep that in mind as we start here in chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So if we forgot from last week, Paul came, he met Aquila and Priscilla. They worked together in the tent-making trade. And he just got done now talking about human wisdom, where Jews want signs and Greeks want logic and reason. But here's the thing, Paul was an intelligent man. He knew how to argue. He had the credentials, but that's not how he shared the gospel. He didn't go there with, super polished, over-the-top speech with eloquent words and stuff. He just chose to speak the truth simply. Now, for me, naturally, I am an arguer. I like to argue things. I desire to have contentious conversations, debating the existence of God. But I also know that those conversations are usually not conversations and they're competitions. And they don't work. So I avoid them because they're fruitless, even though I personally enjoy them. So Paul was an ambassador, not a salesman. And I think that's important because it can be very easy to forget the simplicity of our faith. When we add in the complexity of our thoughts, that should give us it can mess things up. And I think that this should give us a clue about the mindset of the church in Corinth, right? This is probably what they're struggling with, which is probably why he's saying it, right? They're asking questions, they're debating, they're going down rabbit trails, blah, 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 and they're missing the point that, guys, Christ died for you. Quit it with the baptism stuff. Quit it with the, but I'm of Paul, I'm of Peter, right? Just, it's Christ. Stop. It's simple, right? So we have to be careful of running into the weeds. So remember, Paul got here, right? He went to the synagogues first. They didn't like him. They sent him away. And there was probably a lot of tension there and outrage. And so he chose to come humbly to them, right? He didn't go burn down the synagogue when they were sleeping, right? He came humbly. Here's my question. Do you think the church today chooses to speak both boldly and humbly?
I think those that are bold aren't humble, and those that are humble aren't typically bold.
I agree. I think oftentimes we're so quiet we say nothing, or we're so bold we're just looking for a fight. That's not everybody, right? But I think that it does happen probably too much. I think we struggle to find the balance sometimes.
When you said we struggle to find the balance, that's actually really sad, because what we're saying is, if I'm hearing you right, we're struggling to love. Because the reason we approach people boldly and humbly is because we genuinely want to love them and we want them to know the truth. And why do we want them to know the truth? Because we love them and we want them to be saved. So if we can't figure out, and we outright refuse to blend the two, like Christ calls us to be bold and humble, then we know nothing of how God has called us to love.
Well said. I think that took care of the study right there. I mean, seriously, I think that's really what Paul's getting to, right? This battle between.
If we're bold without pride,
Right.
we're more likely to accomplish what you're talking about.
Right.
But if we're bold out of our pride, then
Well, the world has taught us to be quiet because you're going to offend someone.
Sure.
And there's a lot of church hurt and a lot of hurt people out there. So even though they may want to love, they're also in the back of their minds afraid of being hurt. So try to be humble and yet loving and yet not think about getting hurt ourselves, because we have been hurt before.
Yeah.
To get past all of that, to realize that there is a horrible hell that these people are going to be going to if they don't know.
Yeah.
Somehow, in that balance, that we could actually make a difference in somebody's life, but it can't be too bold and it can't be too weak.
Well, guys, it's 8 o'clock, and I told you that I would honor your time and cut things off at 8. So I really appreciate you guys coming out, being willing to listen to me, and not only listen, but to talk to me. I really appreciate that.